Yep, I'd be happy to. Our dear Heavenly Father, we are grateful that we could meet today on this beautiful winter afternoon. We're grateful that we have this opportunity to discuss history through the eyes of true principles and the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. May Thou bless us that we may have the Spirit to be with us, that it may bear truth of all things. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thanks a lot, Heidi. Hold on just 1 second, please. No, that's okay. Okay, great. Okay, so today, and Christina, can you hear us? Hello, Christina?
Hello, I can
Maybe she
hear you.
had to. Oh, you can hear us. Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, today we're going to talk about just an immense topic, the Scramble for Africa. And so I'm sure we'll learn a lot today, and hopefully there'll be some great discussion. I look forward to it. Well, if we look at just some of the bare bones, the facts, until the late 1870s, and of course it happened differently in different places, internal forces shaped the great majority of African history. So that's African forces, forces from within the continent instead of without. If we look then in contrast between 1879 and 1914, the start of World War I, European powers, or external forces, conquered the entire continent of Africa except for two countries, Ethiopia and Liberia. And so the question I want to start off with is, how did this extraordinary change occur?
Well, I know there was a lot of trade going on, just foot traffic way back in the, I don't know, maybe 1600s with the salt mines and everything. So, you know, that kind of opened the door, and then the boats and sailing around Cape Cod opened it a little bit more, but then it was industrialization and the need to export goods and find more resources and open up bigger markets. That's when the explosion happened.
Yeah, excellent, and I appreciate you talking about that trade that did occur in selected areas. But certainly with the Industrial Revolution, which we've spoken about, we start to see these industrialized nations able to have their way with non-industrialized nations. And also, though, they have sort of, as a natural outgrowth of industrialization, they have all of these new needs, and they can see these needs met in non-industrialized nations. You know, chief among them in terms of just the largest chunk that was, in their eyes anyway, up for the taking, you know, was Africa. And so as we look, here's a case study of sort of how it happened, how it really came down to it. If we look at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan in 1898, a few things here for you to compare and contrast, and then tell me what you learn. There was a British expedition versus some native Sudanese. There were 20 machine guns for the British and 4 cannon versus 40,000 spears and muskets. The result, 48 British deaths versus 11,000 Sudanese deaths. So what do you learn?
I'd rather be behind a cannon than use a spear.
Yeah, definitely, right? And certainly, you know, battles like this one, though of course this is an extreme example, happened again and again and again all over Africa, as well as, you know, the Pacific Isles, and Asia and South America. Basically, these non-industrialized nations were able to make weapons that were just almost unstoppable in the face of traditional weapons. And so because of that, despite you know, the brilliance of the military leaders of these traditional cultures, there was just nothing they could do to stand against a bullet. You know, it's interesting. I've seen the movie Zulu, and I'm always fascinated when I watch that movie at how, you know, that these African warriors in this depiction, that of course in some ways is you know, Hollywoodized, in other ways is fairly accurate, but would just rush against you know, British Maxim guns, these machine guns with you know, cowhide shields, thinking that, you know, hey, this works against a spear, it'll work against these new weapons, and of course there were just horrific results. And so this, more than anything else, is the reason why we are able to see industrialized nations have their way with non-industrialized nations. We have Winston Churchill before he was Prime Minister in Britain, here as a witness, and here's what he said about that battle of Omdurman. Christina, would you like to read this quote for us?
Sure. The most signal triumph ever gained by the arms of science over barbarians. Within the space of 5 hours, the strongest and best armed savage army yet arrayed against a modern European power had been destroyed and dispersed, with hardly any difficulty, comparatively small risk, and insignificant loss to the victors.
Okay. So certainly there, a quote with a lot of gravity to it. And if we then think about the scramble for Africa, what would you say? What would you predict? What was that scramble?
Well, if it's so easy to kind of take over as this depicts, then I'm sure as people are looking for, as we've talked about before, new markets, new exports, new, everything like that, then it's all of these powers that have technology to fight against the people without technology are scrambling to take over different parts of Africa so that they can have an advantage in just kind of the world market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Any other predictions? Because certainly, you hit the nail on the head there. The carving up of Africa by European powers for the purposes of industrialization and imperialism. And so if we look then at this map, it's a really interesting map, this scramble for Africa. What does this map teach you about that scramble? And especially look at that color code there that helps out with the countries.
Well, it looks like France and Great Britain were the strongest powers at the time.
Yeah, excellent, right? France in the blue, okay, Great Britain in the hot pink. So excellent. France and Britain, definitely. I think it's very interesting, as we note, which countries held which spots. Of course, that's not as important for us as other things, but certainly, it's of interest as we see how different cultures would then evolve from the influence of the colonizers on the colonized, and especially even if you look today at different countries in Africa, there still is that influence of these great powers, if you will, from Europe. Of interest may be that Liberia over to the left, a very small country on the coast, as well as Ethiopia there on the east, right? The only two independent nations, and we'll talk about their specific circumstances. Okay, let's see. Now, did somebody try to come and then go? Because I saw a little sign that said somebody has left, but I don't know if that was old. Are you all still here?
Heidi's still here.
I'm here too. Yeah, I think we're all here.
Okay, great. I know we had some technical difficulties in the beginning. Well, if we look then, how do you predict colonialism may have differed in the different regions of Africa, and why would you explain those differences in the way that you might explain them?
Well, I would imagine the lands with the best resources went first.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Excellent. What else might you predict?
Each European country probably had a different method for taking over. Some of them just by encroachment and farming, and others more aggressively. And also each tribe had a different way of reacting.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent. Right. So of course, right, different methods of the colonizers and then different responses from the colonized. Key. Excellent. Welcome, Walter. How are you today?
Good.
Good. We're happy to have you. We're just starting to talk about the scramble for Africa, this phenomenon in which Africa was carved up by different imperial European powers between 1870 and then 1914. Okay, well, if we look then at some different expressions of colonialism, I have some case studies for you in Northwestern Africa, Equatorial Africa, Southern Africa, Egypt as a standalone, Ethiopia as a standalone, and then Eastern Africa, generally speaking. So if we look then, hopefully there'll be lots of new information for you, and it's very interesting to see how this unfolded here in Africa. Okay, let's start then. Between 1879 and then 89, so just 10 years, okay, France, as Heidi pointed out, right, as one of those two great powers in imperial Africa, okay, would conquer most of northwestern Africa and then proclaim it a colony called French West Africa. Other nations took smaller portions, Spain, Portugal, Britain, Germany, also in northwestern Africa. Liberia is a very interesting case. It was settled first in 1821 by free African Americans who came over there to escape the the racism or pressures, if you will, of being very different in a predominantly white society in the United States. And so they left there, they settled. But then after the Civil War, after 1865, you saw a large flood of immigrants from the U.S., African American immigrants, back to their, what they would consider a homeland, as much as it could be. There in Liberia. So they would then settle that, and it would be sort of this haven for free blacks in Liberia. Welcome, Caden. How are you? How are you today, Caden?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great. Good to have you. Well, if we continue to look at Northwestern Africa then, and this scramble for Africa, the colonial powers, as they would do in many cases, they would bring the railroads, they would open the interior to the merchants, the missionaries, and the doctors, the teachers, all those people there who could then go inland even further with better communication and transportation that would come from the industrialized nation. Interestingly enough, okay, there's always resistance, as Wendy was pointing out, right? French colonizers in Northwestern Africa would meet fierce resistance from the Muslim population, who really would just try to fight resistance against colonialism for about 30 years before it was really subdued for the most part. And then, if you look at the existing trade networks that Wendy had mentioned, in Northwestern Africa there were a lot of them that were already there. There was a large population. They had been trading for a long time. And so because of that, they would take advantage of these networks. They also would tax the merchants and the farmers there. They invested in railroads and harbors, and then, of course, all the profits would go back home to the stockholders in Europe. And so really, it's very important to notice that the people who are putting the policies into practice on the ground are almost always very different from the people who are reaping the benefits directly back home on the continent in Europe. In present-day Ghana, and as we know, the LDS Church has a large presence in Ghana. There, the British influence was first felt trying to buy cocoa from the African farmers, and they'd buy low, and then they'd sell high back to the European consumers. Okay, so if we look then, and we think back over a couple of the things that we just learned about for Northwestern Africa, what would you say were some of the defining characteristics of colonialism in that region?
Have we been talking about Northwestern, and now we're talking about Northeastern?
Oh, I'm sorry. That should say Northwestern. I'm sorry. It should say Northwestern. So just all the things that we just talked about.
So this was the area where they had a lot of established stuff already because of the ivory and the salt and the slave trade and
Right.
So I'm guessing they were probably pretty used to a lot of traffic by that time. And you said that the Muslims resisted, but it was for many years, but it was ineffective.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly they did the best that they could, but after about 30 years, it really petered out. Excellent. So Wendy brought up a couple great things. Anything else that you think might be a distinguishing feature? As we move through more regions, I think you'll see some of the big differences. Of course, we're just starting with this one. But certainly a large population. Go ahead.
Well, this is the one that was really unique to me that I didn't know about was that area that had, I guess, blacks from America, even before the Civil War, came back to Africa and set up in
Right, Liberia.
Yeah, that's really unique for this region.
Yeah, definitely, and certainly, right. This region, along with Eastern Africa and then it's Ethiopia, okay, would be one of only two that would stay independent throughout this scramble for Africa. So this is a phenomenon for sure. Well, if we look then, I wanted to sort of relate some of these things here because, of course, you can't talk about colonialism without mentioning this very famous term that came from the era, which is the white man's burden. It came from a poem, Rudyard Kipling, British poet and author, wrote a lot of things, including Jungle Book. 1899. Here are just two stanzas from that poem. So who would like to read these? And then let's talk about how they might relate. What is he really saying here about imperialism?
I'll read them.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor, toward the light, why brought he us from bondage, our loved Egyptian knight?
Great, thanks for that. What is he saying here about colonialism? What's the burden, and what's the reaction to it?
No, at first it takes me a while to understand poetry, so first when I read this, I wasn't sure what he meant by the white man's burden, because I think of a burden as being something that isn't self-imposed. But certainly the burden that he's speaking of was kind of self-imposed, because we chose imperialism, or the British chose imperialism.
Sure.
But I guess I know he grew up in India, so he probably didn't feel that it was self-imposed. Because his father, I guess, had to be there for military reasons or whatever. I don't know. This poem just made me really sad. That he says we're over here doing all this work and suffering all of this, and back home we just get blame, and the people from India, I'm sure he was speaking of, just hate us. And I don't know, this reference to Moses at the end just made me think. It just made me really sad. What kind of a position these people are in, that the families that had to endure this.
Definitely, thank you so much, and you really brought up the complexity of the situation, which is what he was trying to bring up, because he's trying to bring up, well, certainly a lot of things. One of them is this notion of, okay, generally speaking, the West, right, for the most part white, quote unquote, if you will, right, in terms of skin color, okay, has this sort of burden that they feel to industrialize the rest of the world. Now, of course, as you said, it's self-imposed, right? In other ways, though, other people would say, well, no, but it's racial, because those who are white have been the ones who've been more advanced, and so we need to sort of bring up our benighted, quote unquote, brothers in Africa and Asia, etc. And so we need to take our civilization to them to help them. And so, of course, we've seen this, it has many manifestations. Sometimes it's a greedy manifestation. Other times it's a very altruistic manifestation, saying, yeah, we have medicines, we have Christianity, we have forms of government that can really help. We want to just share what we have. But yet, of course, as you said, you have the people then who are on the ground in Africa or in India, wherever they may be, doing it. And, they have to work for those who are greedy at home who don't appreciate them, and then they have to work with a population of natives that doesn't appreciate them, that hates them, that tries to revolt, et cetera, et cetera. And so really, if you're one of those people on the ground, you're just sort of attacked by all sides in this very conflicted emotional state with this burden that, whether, or not you consider it a burden. So yeah, there's really a lot to that and a lot of imagery here. What else would we say about this burden? I mean, would you agree with him? I mean, does the white man have a burden, or would you qualify that by saying anybody who's been blessed has a burden to try to share it, or how would we say this here?
Well, I still really feel like it's I don't know why it's called the white man's burden. I feel like it's his nation's burden that they chose. I don't know.
Right. Well, it gets back to this notion that was called social Darwinism, which was the belief at the time that different races had evolved differently, and basically they were at different levels of civilization. And so, for Kipling and for many other imperialists, they truly felt that, some people are just not as advanced as others, that, the white man stands at the pinnacle of civilization, and then you have others who could be civilized if they wanted, but they need help. And then you have others who are even further down on the chain, and they are the barbarians. And those barbarians, they really, over centuries and centuries, need to change their ways to become eventually like, the white man. And so it's sort of they just see this as a progression of civilization with white, Europeans, being at the top. And they're trying to say, well, if we're at the top, can we reach down our hand to pull up these other races? I mean, that's what he's talking about. I'm not necessarily saying that it's right or good, but that's sort of the philosophy that's behind this.
Well, I have to wonder if there isn't a little irony in if you're saying he chose that title, because this is the same guy who wrote that hymn in our hymn book, God of Our Fathers, for Queen Victoria's Jubilee year, where he really rails on Britain for forgetting God and having a presence in all these other countries and trying to expand her borders.
Yeah, definitely. And in fact, for that very reason, that's why if you read the whole poem, he isn't celebrating imperialism. He's really not. And that's the thing. If you take it at face value, you could say, oh, well, he's just saying whites are better and they need to, do this and that to help other people. But in many ways, this poem could be seen as a condemnation of imperialism because of what he did see. That even though, we have these races that some think they're better than others, etc. Just look at all the sadness and the misery that it brings, not only to the colonized, but also to the colonizer. So definitely, I mean, he was not a proponent of imperialism per se, even though he did struggle, with these notions of a racial hierarchy that, today we would probably think very differently about.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments about this here? I think in some ways, if we think about it in a more abstract, benign sense, if we sort of separate it from imperialism and we just think of white man as equating with somebody who's been blessed, whether it's with the gospel, whether it's with affluence, whether it's with knowledge, whether it's with some good opportunity of one kind or another, right? There's of course the famous quote by Joseph Smith. Love is one of the chief characteristics of deity and ought to be manifested by those who aspire to be sons of God. A man filled with the love of God is not content with blessing his family alone, but ranges through the whole world, anxious to bless the whole human race. And notice here, he's talking about one race, the human race. Right? This has been your feeling and caused you to forego the pleasures of home that you might be a blessing to others who are candidates for immortality but strangers to truth. And for so doing, I pray that heaven's choicest blessings may rest upon you. And so, here, if we do, give some colonizers the benefit of the doubt, what relation does this Joseph Smith quote have then to the quote-unquote white man's burden?
Well, the word obligation keeps coming up for me. If you're blessed, you sort of have an obligation to share it with other people.
Excellent, right? And that goes for if you're, red, black, green, yellow, or purple, right? I mean, really, if you're blessed, Heavenly Father expects us to share that to then help other people.
And also that, comparing it to someone with a righteous motive, like the Moses analogy that Rudyard Kipling already brought up, that most often the people that you're trying to give a better life to would really rather prefer their life of bondage, and it's really, it's a lonely, kind of a sad position to be in when the people you wish to help don't wish to be helped.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that, and certainly, I'm sure as we've done missionary work at home or abroad, whatever the case may have been, we probably felt some of that loneliness of, boy, I'm really just trying to help, but people don't want to be helped. So, yeah, thank you for that. Well, if we look at Equatorial Africa, then this is a very different scenario than Northwestern Africa. Here, there was an American journalist, entrepreneur, Henry Morton Stanley. This is the Stanley from, Dr. Livingston, I presume. Well, he convinced Belgium's King Leopold II, and there's a very famous book about this, King Leopold's Ghost, if you're interested. Anyway, to invest in trading posts along the southern bank of the Congo River in Equatorial Africa. Through treaty, then France gained a large area along the north bank of the Congo and called it French Equatorial Africa. So we see, Belgium to the south, France to the north. And then after that, this is when Germany starts to really come into the mix. Feeling left out, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called the Berlin Conference of '84 and '85. And at the conference, the major European powers decided of this course of what they called effective occupation. It was a strategy that they decided needed to replace trading relationships between Africans and Europeans. Basically, they decided for colonialism. We need to go there and have a presence and maintain a colonial presence. So each power then committed to send troops to Africa to divide its equatorial land among the industrial nations of Europe. And so keep in mind, this is being done at a drawing board in Europe, right? Okay, and the powers created political boundaries on paper, and then they sent soldiers to make them a reality. And so we have Germany, France, Belgium, Portugal, and Spain taking, what could be called the heart of the continent. The book by Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, refers to the Belgian Congo, to this heart of the continent, as well as to the hearts of those who colonize in many ways. Okay, so if we look then, and we compare it to Northwestern Africa, in Equatorial Africa, we have a very small population and then few existing trade networks. And so as a result, right, the colonial powers don't govern directly, but they give administration to private companies who then use soldiers and raise taxes. Okay, and these private companies gain monopolies on natural resources and trade in exchange for their administering of the colonial presence. Free from supervision, though, right, these private companies commit atrocities, more so than probably in any other area of Africa, to squeeze profits out of the natives and their land. And so specifically, if you look at the rubber trade in the Belgian Congo, what was called specifically the Congo Free State, which was King Leopold's private state, it was notorious for things like you'd find in this quote here. So who'd like to read this very sad quote about the Belgian Congo?
I'll read it.
Okay, go ahead.
We begged the white men to leave us alone, saying we could get no more rubber. But the white men and their soldiers said, "Go, you are only beasts yourselves, you are only meat." We tried, always going further into the forest, and when we failed and our rubber was short, the soldiers came to our towns and killed us. Many were shot, some had their ears cut off, others were tied up with ropes around their necks and bodies and taken away.
Okay, thanks for that. So certainly, here with this primary source, we see, sort of the very evil side of imperialism in Equatorial Africa. By 1906, though, the British press really started to get on the Belgian private companies there. They started to publicize the abuses, and so by 1908, the rubber boom had ended. Leopold's private state was given to the Belgian government, and a more ethical administration was promoted. Okay, and so if we look then, and you think about Equatorial Africa, what would you say would be some of the defining characteristics that you would want to remember?
Oh, the Joseph Conrad novel kind of pretty well sums it up. Just
definitely,
just
a
dark,
very
dark
moving and disturbing book, for sure. So definitely, Equatorial Africa is certainly notorious just for doing things the wrong way, you could say. Well, if we look at this, then I think it is important to tie this back to the Atonement. This great quote by Elder M. Russell Ballard. Christina, would you like to read this for us?
Sure. Brothers and sisters, I believe that if we could truly understand the atonement of the Lord Jesus Christ, we would realize how precious is one son or daughter of God. I believe our Heavenly Father's everlasting purpose for His children is generally achieved by the small and simple things we do for one another. At the heart of the English word atonement is the word one. If all mankind understood this, there would never be anyone with whom we would not be concerned, regardless of age, race, gender, religion, or social or economic standing. We would strive to emulate the Savior and would never be unkind, indifferent, disrespectful, or insensitive to others.
Thanks. So what's the relation then between Equatorial Africa and this quote?
Well, they certainly weren't practicing this.
Right.
They kind of lost the humanity in the people that they were enslaving and forcing to do things.
Definitely. Thank you so much for that. And, really, you compare the world's way with God's way, and there are times that in the world's way, in its just distorted, sort of twisted view of reality, being fed by the father of lies, that they truly can see certain people as being better, certain people as being inferior, certain people as being justifiably conquered or enslaved or attacked or brutalized, but when we try to understand the world in God's way, we realize that each of us and each person in the world, regardless of any identifier, is a son or daughter of God, and as such should be treated that way. And when we treat them that way, wonderful things happen. When we don't, we see very sad things happen. Southern Africa, then, an interesting case. So we've moved from Northwestern now to Equatorial to then Southern Africa. Dutch settlers had lived along the Cape of Good Hope in Southern Africa since the mid-17th century, 1650s. Throughout the 19th century, then, the 1800s, Afrikaners, descendants of the early Dutch settlers, moved inland from the Cape, and they kept going north and northwest, northeast. In the 19th century, British settlers also arrived and brought, and here's the third group, a substantial Indian population. And so now we have these three groups plus the native Africans in their many different groups that were there. And so now we have Afrikaners, British, Indians from India, as well as native Africans, all living in what we call today the country of South Africa. There were rich pastures, farmlands, unbelievable amounts of just diamonds, gold, and copper. South Africa has always been just the jewel of the continent of Africa in terms of its natural resources. There are many other raw materials that attracted Europeans. 1868, if you think of De Beers diamonds, okay, this is when that sort of gets its start here, the discovery of massive supply of diamonds at Kimberley. It lures thousands of prospectors from Europe. 1871, we have Britain annexing Kimberley, okay, from the Afrikaners. So of course they're furious with the British. To maintain its hold on Southern Africa, Britain would also then fight against both the Xhosa or Xhosa peoples as well as the Zulu peoples in bloody wars between 77 and 79. One battle of note that you may have heard of or you may hear of in the future is the Battle of Isandlwana. And so this is before being defeated ultimately by the British. The Zulu warriors would hand British troops their worst loss ever to a non-industrial people. This was just one of those rare instances where native tactics and mass was able to overwhelm the British technology. Britain then would also encroach on Afrikaner lands and then muscle its way into the richest mines in their territories. We see then, of course, with Britain doing all this, war is the result, because as it tried to annex the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, it would lead to the South African War of '89 to 1902. Britain would win, but it would be at a very high cost, and so then they'd pull out. In terms of the intensity of their colonizing efforts, and so that's when you'd have the Union of South Africa created in 1910, and it would be an independent nation. Ironically, it was interesting as the British influence waned, the Afrikaner influence then would wax stronger, and Afrikaners would eventually emerge as the ruling class there in South Africa. Despite the large populations of Indians as well as native Africans. And so those Afrikaners would deny suffrage and then other civil rights or privileges to native Africans as well as Indians. Just one example, and we'll talk more about apartheid later, but the Native Lands Acts of 1913 forced Africans onto reservations, and then it would be a precursor of the apartheid era that would start formally in 1948 and go to 94. So if we look then at South Africa, Southern Africa, what would be some of the defining characteristics of colonialism in that region?
Well, it sounds like some of their own people were the abusers instead of just all the Europeans. Mm-hmm. But maybe you're saying that came later.
Well, are you talking about the Afrikaners?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, they in many ways considered themselves to be African loosely because they were there so long. They've been there since 1650. But Afrikaners were white. They were Dutch by descent, and so depending on when you want to say somebody becomes a certain nationality or group, they were certainly European, but they'd been in Africa a lot longer than the British.
Oh, so it was still the white-skinned against the black-skinned, though.
Right,
basically.
That's right.
Okay, all right.
That's a great question, and thank you for helping me to clarify that.
There seems to be a draw to this region because of the rich mines there with diamonds and whatnot, so there seems to be a pretty intense fight over this area.
Yeah, definitely, because if we think some of the other areas of Africa, much less desirable, and so there's a lot less competition. Basically, you'd have colonial powers come in, and then they would stay, virtually uncontested by other European powers. But here, we constantly see this back and forth between the Afrikaners from, the Netherlands originally, and then the British. It's a great point, Christina. And then certainly another distinguishing characteristic of this region that would really come into play in the 20th century would be the fact that it was a population with large amounts of Africans, British, Dutch, or Afrikaner, and then also Indian. And so we'll see how that would play out in the 20th century. Well, if we look at that, I think I was trying to think of an interesting relation to this, one that was maybe a little bit further detached, but one that might apply even more to us today. So I found this great quote by President Hinckley. Walter, would you read this for us? And then let's think about how we can relate that to South Africa.
Sure. Let us Latter-day Saints reach out to others not of our faith. Let us never act in the spirit of arrogance or with a holier-than-thou attitude. Rather, may we show love and respect and helpfulness toward them. We are greatly misunderstood, and I fear that much of it is of our own making. We can be more tolerant, more neighborly, more friendly, more of an example than we have been in the past. Let us teach our children to treat others with friendship, respect, love, and admiration. That will yield a far better result than will an attitude of egotism and arrogance.
Okay, thank you. So how does this relate then to what we just talked about with the region of South Africa?
Well, are you referring kind of like to what the apartheid result? Is that the connection that you're making?
That could be part of it, or you could go earlier too. I mean, however you'd like to do it. What would you say, Wendy?
Just that those Afrikaners could have had things could have been so much different if they hadn't have separated themselves in the manner that they did. I don't think, like it says, I fear much of it is our own making. We're greatly misunderstood, and I fear that much of it is our own making. They certainly didn't. Apartheid is not showing love and respect and helpfulness.
Yeah, thank you for that point. Would anybody else speak to this quote?
Well, I didn't think it was specific to what we're talking about, the southern area. I don't think it's specific to that. I think it applied to all areas.
Sure. And how so?
Well, we should just always have respect for people, regardless of. We shouldn't see people as less than us. If we see ourselves as blessed, then we should be very careful how we decide to share what we have with others, and do it in a respectful way.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. Certainly, I'm sure we've all talked to people who, unfortunately, ran into a member of the church who, in his or her zeal for sharing absolute truth that, could be a huge blessing to anybody's life, maybe did it perhaps in an abrasive way, in a derogatory way, in a way that was really just off-putting, to the person. And so because of that, they ended up becoming a stumbling block to the work, when we ran into them and tried to share the gospel. I don't know if you've had that experience. I have. So I'll keep that in mind for sure. Well, if we look at Egypt then, Egypt, of course, was a little bit different too. We think of the Suez Canal. We've talked about that before. But by 1882, Britain occupied Egypt to protect its interest in the Suez Canal. It just came in and said, this will help us with what we want to get from the Mediterranean through the Red Sea and then down to the Indian Ocean. And then for the next 70 years, Britain indirectly ruled Egypt through a puppet government. And so there was an Egyptian government, so there wasn't a colonial government like there was in some other places in Africa. But certainly it was a puppet government, and so what kind of a government is that? In 1902, Britain built the very famous, you may have heard of it, the Aswan Dam, to harness the Nile River for its cotton crops. And so we see, once again, the classic example of the raw materials from the colonized nation, and then that would be brought back to the industrial nation for manufacture. British-influenced Egyptian government levied heavy taxes to pay for the occupation forces, right? And so if you think of the American Revolution and you think of a standing army, right? Think of how much the colonists hated a standing army, right? And then especially you think of how much they despised even the notion that the king could tax them for a standing army in their country during a time of peace, that they didn't want. And so, this once again would cause a lot of anger for the Egyptians. Also, they were really upset about the popularization of alcohol and then increased freedom for women, which would anger the Egyptian Muslim population, and so that would lead to conflict there. Okay. If we look then at Eastern Africa, because of course Egypt is part of Eastern Africa. From Egypt, right, the British would move south. They'd conquer territories that they would call Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Uganda, British East Africa, British Somaliland. These are many of these are countries we hear about in the news today, and so it's just interesting to be reminded of the colonial heritage that they have, the English-speaking heritage that they have, and so that's why many times if you meet Africans, they'll have some exposure to English or to French, or one of these other colonial languages. Italy, France, Germany, Portugal would also grab land along the Red Sea and Indian Ocean there in Eastern Africa. And then Eastern Africa is also unique because remember, we've talked about Liberia as an independent nation. Here's the second independent nation in Africa during colonialism. This would be Ethiopia under Emperor Menelik II, and they would have successful resistance to colonial rule. So if we look at the Ethiopia as a case study, in 1889, it was interesting when Menelik came to become emperor. They were already threatened by Sudanese Muslims, by France, and by Italy. And so for years, Ethiopia, and this is just a unique case, and you wonder why others didn't follow, they had invested in European weapons. And so through the Treaty of Churchill in Italy, 1889, it would contract for even more. And so they were well armed in the European fashion. And so Italy, always a latecomer to these games, always sort of, the smaller, brother trying to catch up and run at the heels of his older brothers. Italy comes and tries to colonize Ethiopia to start some of its own imperialism in Africa. In 1895, the Ethiopians, though, would be able to repulse them because they had thousands of rifles, machine guns, as well as some artillery. And so at the very famous Battle of Adwa in 1896, Menelik's army would defeat 20,000 Italian troops. And so this was a big deal for Africans, and Africans today will look back to this battle. Ethiopia would become the only African state to successfully defend its independence from European imperialism. Liberia was sort of just a different case, didn't have to do as much, but Ethiopia would fight and maintain its own independence. So if we look then, right, sort of the defining characteristics of Eastern Africa, including Egypt and Ethiopia, what would you say? What would you want to remember about Eastern Africa?
Well, from what I hear about Ethiopia today, it's hard to imagine them defending anything. They just seem so weak and starved. So that's something that I would want to remember, is that at one time they were strong, and I'm not sure what's happened to get them to the point they are now, but I can't imagine them defending themselves today, unless maybe the whole country isn't what we see on TV or whatever. I don't know.
Right. Well, certainly lots of corrupt governments, as well as famine and disease, taken their toll on Ethiopia. It's a great comment, Heidi. Thank you for that. What else would you want to remember then from Eastern Africa?
Oh, that puppet governments aren't much better than just an outright takeover.
Yeah, great, right?
I really hate them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, why hide behind the facade, right? It's not like it's any more righteous, really. So, yeah, definitely. Thank you for that.
It's just more deceiving to the people in your nation back home.
Right.
Because
they don't.
Yeah, and so for that reason, I even think they're worse, because people don't
excellent. Thank you for that.
The evil that you're doing.
Thank you, Wendy, for that. Well, if we look then, here's a great article, actually from the New Era. I found it in 1986 by Elder Charles Didier, now emeritus, former in the presidency of the 70s. He said, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty." Of course, quoting the famous 2 Corinthians 3:17 verse. He said, I can personally testify to the importance for you, the future generation, to prepare and continue to act with the Spirit of the Lord to defend your liberties. A democracy requires men and women to be agents unto themselves to defend their freedom. When a democracy collapses, it is because the individuals and families are dropping their arms. What are the usual symptoms? First, there is a feeling of fear, then resignation, then we get used to the worst. To get used to is a horrible phrase, to say the least. To get used to violence, to degradation, to mediocrity, to oppression, to humiliation. History is a great teacher if we are willing to learn. It teaches us that anarchy and permissiveness always lead directly to the dictatorship of sin, to the submissiveness of our spirits, to the slavery of our bodies. So what would we say about this quote here?
You know, I think it's powerful that, you know, I like the last part where he's talking about history. I think Patrick Henry also said that he knows no other way better of judging the future but by the past. And if we can learn history with the Spirit as well, and you know, learn what God would have us do, like it says at the top, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And you know, that's what it takes to preserve your rights. You have to recognize the Lord and His hand in your lives, and understand what you value, in that we do have our agency, and in that it takes a moral and righteous people to maintain your liberty.
Yeah, excellent, right? And I love how you're talking about, you know, we don't need to repeat the mistakes of the past, right? We should learn about them and learn from them. So, excellent. Would anybody else like to comment on this one?
Well, just the whole...
Go ahead.
Sorry, Wendy. I was just going to say just the whole line where it says that we get used to it, and that saying getting used to something is a horrible phrase. Because, I don't know, I think we see a lot of that nowadays where people just rationalize it and say it's really not that bad, which is another way of saying we're getting used to it. So I think it's interesting to see the context he puts this into.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you think about people saying, well, hey, that's just the way it is, right? Is it really? Or have we just accepted it as being the way it is, right? Yeah. And so what were you going to say, Wendy?
I just thought, wow, he's trying to put too many concepts into one sentence, because honestly, he's comparing politics and military strategy, and then comparing it to spiritual strategy, which is cool. But wow, my mind is spinning right now, and
yeah,
you know, because I'm thinking, yeah, you know, if those African nations would have had law and order and strength and togetherness, they would have been able to fight against this and avoided this dictatorship that happened to them, or the slavery and the bondage that happened to them. And the spiritual analogy that he's making is cool, because we don't tend to think of that if we govern our lives with lawlessness, we will become slaves. So anyway, that's a lot to try to sum up. Wow.
Definitely, and especially imagine doing this with French as your first language. I mean, anyway, so I always marvel at the general authorities, you know, who speak another language as a first language and then write in English. I'm always amazed at what they do. Well, okay, so if we look then at just some of the native responses, because Wendy had brought this up at the beginning of the class, some of the native responses to colonialism, you could group them into sort of three basic categories. Cooperation, right, would be the first, right? You know, some natives welcomed Europeans. They saw them as allies against traditional enemies. They said, hey, they have the power. If I can get on their good side, I can beat the people I've always wanted to beat. Well, of course, they didn't realize that. That would also mean that the Europeans could beat them if they ever wanted to. You know, but some of them truly, you know, took advantage of opportunities for westernization. They really embraced it. They tried to fit the best of the West into the best of their own traditions, and they started to, you know, embrace some of the philosophies that, you know, we've talked about in this class. You know, governmental philosophies, Christianization, industrialization, et cetera, et cetera. And then these people then would work for colonial administrations, and then they would proselytize Western ways, you know, to their neighbors. Well, that's sort of one, cooperation. Well, if we think of then resistance as sort of the opposite of cooperation, Okay? Other natives resented the economic, political, cultural, and military invasions of European powers, and they fought tenaciously to keep their independence and ways of life. We've talked about some of them today, the Zulu in southern Africa, Ethiopians in eastern Africa, the Asante in western Africa, just 3 examples, but certainly the many, many groups who would choose resistance rather than cooperation. Well, interestingly enough, and this is so interesting to me as I was reading about it, more so than cooperation, more so than resistance, most people in Africa chose non-participation as long as they could. Most Africans neither joined nor fought European colonizers. They tried to carry on life as usual without conforming to or resisting imperialism, which became increasingly difficult to do as colonialism disrupted more elements of traditional life the longer it was in place. And this was hard because traditional rulers would lose all authority. It would become almost impossible for them to retain the agency necessary to keep their peoples away from imperialism's many influences. Yet, many just tried. They tried to say, hey, maybe there's some Europeans down in the city. Maybe they'll send some missionaries up this way. But let me just try to ignore them. Let me just try to do my own thing. I won't join. I won't fight. And maybe they'll just go away eventually. Well, so there are 3 different responses. What do you think was the most effective response? Why? And then what response would you have chosen and why?
Can you first tell us what became of the Ethiopians? I mean, Heidi and I are both in the dark. You know, it seems like what they did would be the correct thing, but what did it lead to?
Right. Well, certainly you have a long period where you have Ethiopians ruling Ethiopians, and they have this independent nation. You have Menelik, and then you have a succession of rulers following him. But the problem is that you start to see corruption in the government. Corruption then weakens. As my grandfather would always say, the fish rots from the head. So when you have a corrupt government, it trickles down into all other aspects of life. And so then coupled with the terrible devastation of disease and then famine, as well as then civil war in Ethiopia, as well as war from without with other nations in Africa, you just see this total breakdown, bit by bit over the course of the 20th century. And so sort of this proud tradition of, resisting Europe, would really come to an end because especially of corruption. That would then make everything else so much harder to deal with, and it would make the negative influence so much easier to seep into the culture and destroy it from within.
So then I would say that that fighting tyranny would be the best response, but you have to at the same time that you fight external tyranny, you have to fight internal tyranny. Mm-hmm. And I guess that didn't happen in Ethiopia.
Right.
What I mean by fighting internal tyranny is, if clearly they hadn't learned to conquer the evil within themselves, even though they could conquer the external enemy.
Yeah, definitely, and that's why, of course, in American Heritage, we teach the importance of self-governance first, right? Don't wait for somebody, on the outside to do it. Don't wait for an external government to tell you what to do and how to live. You choose how to live the best life for yourself so you can self-govern, because that's ultimately the way that things work best. Okay, and then maybe just quickly here before, because I have a class coming in actually, as it is right now. But which native response would you have chosen and why? I'm just kind of interested to see if you have an opinion.
Well, my guess is I probably would have chosen the non-participation because that seems to be the status quo. Mm-hmm. And I would have thought, well, maybe they'll do good for us, maybe they won't. I'll just kind of wait and see. Mm-hmm. Great. Unfortunately, but I'm just being honest. That's probably what I would have chosen.
Sure. Right. Anybody else?
I was going to share that there's a principle in the gospel about being hot and cold, but lukewarm is the worst. But I'd have to agree with Heidi. I think I probably would have been kind of the lukewarm one in the middle in this situation. But I think in the end, it's probably better to either, conform or to fight, to kind of choose what side you're going to be on. But I'm too hesitant of a person to do that sometimes. So I think I probably would have kind of tried to live my own life and see what would happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. Anybody else then before we wrap up for today? Okay.
Come
well,
on, I want to hear someone who said they would have resisted. Somebody out there say they would have resisted.
I can can only say that I wish I would have, but there's a greater chance that I would have if a really strong leader was out there that I could get behind, you know? If there's a movement, it's a lot easier. I don't know what I would have done. This is a hard one.
Yeah, no, it is. It certainly is a hard one. And just so you know, there's more to this slideshow. We'll go over it in our tutorials. So stay tuned for more good things to come that we can chew over together. Anyway, but thanks so much for your participation. We've covered a lot of ground today in Africa, and thank you so much for that. I look forward to our class tomorrow. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.